All right, we'll be doing lots of chatting about the Finance Minister's budget in the coming days. But to chat a little bit about that and this fuel price, we're now joined by Chief Economist at Econometrix at Z8, Dr. Azar Jammine. Azar, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening to your viewers.
So, they say that this fuel price, government often points to the rand-dollar exchange rate and the price of Brent crude. That's the usual excuse, but is that all that really goes into the mix in getting us to this record number?
In the very recent past, yes, those are the two main factors that are contributing. And in fact, the expected increase next week is almost entirely attributable to a huge jump in international crude oil prices arising out of fears of shortages of oil. OPEC members have been struggling to increase output. And on top of that, now you have fears of a war in the Ukraine, which could scupper the ability of Russia to export oil. And as a result, oil prices have been extremely strong. And were it not, in fact, ironically, for a slight appreciation in the rand-dollar exchange rate, one might have been looking for an even bigger increase in fuel prices next week. But when it comes to April, that's a different story. Then we'll start seeing a number of other factors kicking in to affect the fuel price. The obvious ones being the fuel levy and the road accident fund levy. And traditionally, these have been increased by at least as much as the underlying inflation rate. In the case of the fuel levy, which is just under 4 rand a litre, if you add 5%, you're adding about 20%, 20 cents a litre onto that. And on top of that, you're going to get another 10 cents or 15 cents a litre on the road accident fund levy. So purely on those accounts, irrespective of what the oil price does, there will be an add-on of about 30 cents a litre at the beginning of April, but not next week yet, not next month yet.
All right, we'll talk about those levies just now. I'm just curious in terms of what the impact of this increasing fuel price will have, because pretty much everything is affected. I mean, goods and services have a fuel component most of the time. So taxis will raise their prices. People going to work will start paying more to get to work and so on and so forth. What does that do for the economy and for thorny issues like inflation?
Unfortunately, it means that the average consumer will have less money available to spend on everything else once fuel prices rise. And they have been doing so for the last few months. But ironically, they are not doing so at a pace anywhere near as great as what happened this time last year. So ironically, the actual inflation rate, the year-on-year change in the average price basket of consumer goods, will not rise as a result of these increases for purely statistical reasons.
All right, so let's talk about these levies. I had a conversation with Outer not so long ago, and they seem to suggest that, you know, part of the problem is government inefficiencies, and they compensate for those inefficiencies through levies because they're not running things properly, and to balance the books, we end up having to fork out in these levies.
Unfortunately, that is the reality, Peter, and the most classic example of that is in the case of electricity, unfortunately, where many would argue that Eskom would not have needed to raise electricity tariffs as steeply had it not been for the massive state capture that had occurred that depleted many of its financial resources, and now the burden is being transferred to the ordinary consumer. Effectively, these big tariff increases are a tax on the consumer. They are not measured as such, but effectively that's what they are.
And so does that mean that had we been better at managing our economy and our departments, that the fuel prices wouldn't have gone up as much via the levies?
One would think so. I'm not an expert. I haven't studied all the there are many little levies that go into making up the fuel price. But I would imagine that some of them are indeed linked to inefficiencies and our inability to generate as much revenue as we ought to have done because of those inefficiencies. So we do compensate for that with extra tariffs. But, I'm not an expert at that. I don't want to stick my neck out and say exactly where that is happening.
So does the finance minister look at these levies much like sin taxes, where literally a percentage is just put on and it is a passive tax? So, you go fill up your car and essentially it just gets taken away. Or is there some thought about actually the amount?
Traditionally, they have been following the inflation rate, and in some cases, like sin taxes, they've been increasing these by the inflation rate plus a small extra percentage in the belief that if they raise sin taxes by more than inflation, people will start consuming less alcohol and smoking less. Whether that is verified by the reality is open to question. And unfortunately, what we've seen in recent years is illegal means have been found to actually gain access to a lot of these products. And the government has ended up losing rather than gaining revenue because a lot of these products are being sold illicitly without the relevant taxes being paid. The more that the excise duties rise, the more that there is this a temptation to embark upon illicit ways of selling these goods.
All right. This next question is probably unfair to you because, it's probably not in your game. But part of that fuel price is the road accident fund. And that fund has been notorious for being ripped off and bankrupted over time. And again, the taxpayer ends up having to bail it out.
Well, in many ways, that is the element of the fuel levies that is most vulnerable to criticism in terms of being increased because of inefficiencies. And even in today's media, it's been full of the stories about how the road accident fund levy may well have been captured and we are ending up as consumers paying more for it. And I wish the average member of the public would recognize how costly state capture has been, and that it's not nice guys who are actually trying to help the poor take money away from the rich, that in fact it's nice guys enriching themselves this way at the expense of the poor.
All right, let's now start to talk a little bit about the budget. What is the finance minister busy on his desk right now trying to balance?
The biggest challenge he's got is the following. It's actually not so much a bad story. He will have been greatly surprised at the extent to which government tax revenue will have risen this past year. And that is because the economy grew a lot faster than had been anticipated a year ago. And the reason is principally because commodity prices around the world have risen extremely sharply, especially many of the minerals that we export, such as coal and platinum group metals, copper, aluminium, and the like. And that has been a function of the fact that the world economy itself has surprised in being a lot stronger than anticipated. The rollout of vaccinations occurred earlier and more efficiently than many had anticipated. And we've also started seeing the throughput of massive, unprecedented fiscal and monetary stimulus injected into the world's largest economies. It's creating a huge inflationary surge now, and there are now some challenges in that regard. But interestingly, with commodities, they are being bought precisely because they are seen as hedges against inflation, buy commodities now because their prices may be higher later. Also, because of the COVID virus, there's been interruption to the development and exploration of new commodities or of new sources of commodities, and so there are fears of shortages of supply. Superimpose on that this whole move towards clean energy and carbon neutrality and the need for massive investment into new kinds of technology. And what has happened is there's been far too little investment in new oil fields and coal fields. So suddenly, but we're still needing those right now. So suddenly their prices have surged ahead. In the case of new technologies, electric vehicles are going to need a lot of copper and platinum group metals. And so these have been benefiting. The result has been that South Africa's revenue, government revenue, has surged by 270 billion rand over the period April to December compared with the same period of 2020. And a lot of that has had to do with the companies involved in mining these minerals, making massive profits and having to pay tax over to the government with that. Now, does the government regard that as permanent revenue, or does it have to budget on the grounds of maybe that bonanza is going to disappear soon? And that is the biggest challenge that Godongwana is going to face, because if he wants to be cautious, then he will not be able to be very magnanimous in what he includes in the budget. There will be others, and some are calling, for example, this is a time to introduce a basic income grant, because we're collecting so much revenue, without thinking that maybe commodity prices could fall very sharply at some point should the world economy slow down now as a result of action being taken to quell inflationary pressures and interest rates start rising. And then suddenly the government will be faced with having promised a lot of money and not being able to deliver. So that is the dilemma that he's facing in this coming budget, which is quite a tricky one. I personally sense that he'll be more on the cautious side, but he has already played one card here, and that is to extend the special social grant of 350 Rand a month to 10.5 million people for another year. That will cost 44 billion Rand, but in the context of the 270 billion Rand overshoot in revenue, that is probably affordable and worth taking a chance. But interestingly, he's committed only to this coming year. Just in case things turn already later in the year, then he doesn't have to stick to that promise beyond March 2023.
All right, just to be clear, because there's a lot of expectation when the finance minister speaks, almost as if he's the one with the magic wand to fix the economy and fix everything. Is that his job, or is he more a purser managing the country's accounts?
Theoretically, he's more a purser managing the country's accounts. It's up to the government and the leadership to decide on what policies to pursue. And then he takes those as given, and in the context of what he is given, he tries to balance the books as well as possible and prevent us having to borrow too much money to pay our way. Why that is so important is because the higher the government debt level goes, the more pessimistic do international investors become about the likelihood of them getting their money back from the government should they lend them that money. The other way of looking at it, the higher do long-term interest rates go. And the result is that currently the government is spending 12% of of what it spends just in interest payments, and that figure is earmarked to rise to 16% by 2024. So between now and 2024, according to the previous budgets, we will have 5% less available to spend on everything else, simply because we're going to be paying more interest, having accumulated so much debt during the years of state capture. In 2007, our public debt to GDP ratio is 21%. It is now around 70%. And so interest payments have been eating away more and more into the ability of government to spend on anything else.
Azar Jammine, always great talking to you. I'm sure that there'll be lots of chats in the next 3 days, before and after. But thanks so much indeed for giving us some insights tonight.
Pleasure.
All right, that's Dr. Azar Jammine speaking to us about the fuel price hike. We're going to be paying, it seems, according to AA, as much as 21 Rand a litre. And then, of course, the budget speech expected next week, on Wednesday, the 23rd, in Godongwana's first budget. And it's going to be quite a challenge for him, as we've just been hearing from Dr. Azar Jammine.